Next.js has really struggled with caching since the introduction of the app router. They were way over caching almost everything in your application. It was incredibly messy and difficult to deal with, and they've been trying to fix this problem, but so far they haven't quite gotten there. That is until now. The new DynamicIO and use cache features, I think, are the perfect middle ground for caching. They're relatively easy to understand, they're pretty simple to use, and they give you really powerful features without automatically opting you into all that caching nonsense you don't need. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over what this new DynamicIO and use cache feature is. I'm going to show you everything you need to know about it and talk about why I think it's so much better than everything that they had before. Also, before we get started, I do want to mention my Next.js course is currently on sale. I just updated it to the newest version of Next.js 15. It's currently on sale for 10% off, only for a few days. It'll be linked in the description if you want to check that out. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. The starting code for this project is relatively straightforward. I have a function here called getRandomData, and all it does is it calls a promise for 1 second just to emulate some type of waiting, and then it returns to us a random number. And the whole idea of this function is to emulate any type of asynchronous code, whether it's accessing the file system, accessing a database, making a fetch request, creating a random number, anything that is asynchronous is what this function represents, because in DynamicIO, everything asynchronous behaves exactly the same. There's no more weird intricacies where fetch works differently than other promises and so on. Everything works the same in DynamicIO. So that's what this function right here is trying to emulate. And all we're doing on the home page is we're just rendering out a random number to the page. And then we also have a second page, which is this user page, which I'll navigate to real quick. And this user page is slightly more complicated. You can see here we have params because this is like a user page where I can type in an ID, for example, and then ID just shows up right here, whatever the ID is. And I also have search params. Whatever I type into this form is going to be showing right here as my search param. So as you can see, I'm taking my ID as well as my search params and showing them to the user on the page. And then I'm just using the built-in form inside of Next.js to be able to do that form submission with the searching. And then I can go back to the home page. So this application right now, I actually have built using the normal way of Next.js before DynamicIO and before use cache, so I can show you the differences between the before and the after. And you'll notice when I refresh this page, it actually looks like everything's working. I get a completely random number every single time. But that's because I'm in development mode right now. But this page is actually a static cached page in the old way of doing things in Next.js. As you can see, it's a static page for this route. And if I go to the built production version of the site, this is the production version, you see every time I refresh, I get the exact same number showing up on my page. So inside of the normal way of doing things with Next.js caching that's been around for a while, this is a static page. And if I go to this page, this is also a static page. So all these things are going to be static pages because inside of the old way of doing Next.js, everything is cached by default unless you specifically tell the page not to be cached and that it is a dynamic page. Now, when we swap over to DynamicIO, you'll notice major differences. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And all I need to do is open up my next config and enable the experimental flag DynamicIO and just set it to true. That's going to swap us over to this new DynamicIO and use cache way of doing caching, which I think is much better. Just note that right now at the time of recording this video, this is a canary only experimental feature. So you need to be using the canary version of Next.js for this to work. Now, once we have that done, if we give our page a quick refresh, you're going to notice not only do we get an error, we also have a dynamic page now instead of a static page. So you can see here our route is dynamic. And that's because anytime that you're using DynamicIO, if you have asynchronous code anywhere in your application, so if you're using async await anywhere in your application, it's automatically going to turn that page into a dynamic page, which is huge. This means there's no longer any automatic caching for things like fetches or other things like that. Anytime you use dynamic data, your page is going to be marked as dynamic. So instead of automatically forcing you into caching and you have to opt out of caching, it's the opposite. You now are automatically opted into dynamic routes, and you need to specifically say you want to opt into the caching way of doing things. This is much more intuitive and I really like it. Also, you'll notice we're getting an error. Now, this error is not super important to understand exactly what the text message on it means, but essentially anytime you're using asynchronous code that is not inside of your cache, and right now we have no caching at all, you need to make sure you wrap that code inside of a suspense boundary. That way Next.js can send down all of your non-dynamic code to the user right away, while the other code can be streamed in from the background. Because right now when we refresh this page, there's a 1 second delay before any content can show up on our page, and that's because it needs to wait for this data. If we wrap this code in a suspense instead, we can make that much better. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm just going to come in here with an async function. We're going to call it our suspended component. It doesn't really matter what this component is called or anything like that. And inside here, we're just going to return this data right here. So I'm going to come in here with a return and return get random data. And now we don't need to get our random data in here anymore. And instead, we can return that suspended component. So I'm going to come in here, call that suspended component just like that. And what I need to do is just wrap this in a suspense boundary, like I said. So we're going to come in here, wrap that in a suspense boundary. And just to make it easy to see what's going on, let's give that a fallback state, which is a p tag that says loading. Now, if I give this a save and I refresh our page, you'll notice we immediately get all the stuff around this. So our home and our link immediately gets sent down to the user. But the content inside of here that's suspended is going to wait for a specific period of time until that data comes in, and then it's going to show it to us. So you can see when I refresh, I get that loading text, and a second later, it gives me the real text that I want. Now this page is still a dynamic page. As you can see, I go over here, my route is still a dynamic route. So that's exactly what I want. Every time a user comes to this page, it's going to give them a brand new route to fetch. So every time a user comes to this page, it's going to call this code over again. But the really nice thing is I have more static content that can be sent down to the user immediately, such as this H1 and this link tag here. And the only stuff that's dynamic, which is the suspense section, is streamed down to the user at a later point. We can even see this if we view our page source. We'll just give that a second to load. I'll put on line wrap here. And if we scroll down a little ways, you'll see this section right here where it says right in here, H1 home, and then I have my p tag that says loading, and then I have my link right here for user 1. So you can see it immediately sends down all the content with that fallback data inside of it. And then after a 1 second delay for this data to come back, it's going to stream that into this particular section. So that's something that I really like. And for the most part, it's relatively easy to work with your code. Essentially, if you have asynchronous code, you either need to put it inside of a cache, which I'll cover later in this video, or you need to wrap it inside of a suspense so Next.js knows what it can stream down immediately versus what it needs to wait for. Now it gets a little bit more tricky when we start dealing with asynchronous things like params and search params. So let's go over to that user 1 page, and immediately you'll notice we get some issues. First of all, this is now a dynamic page, which is exactly what we want, but we get the exact same error message showing up on our page. And that's because we're awaiting params and we're awaiting search params. Essentially, we have asynchronous code we're awaiting for, but we're not wrapping that inside of any suspense. So again, anytime that we use async await, we need to wrap this inside of a suspense or cache it to make this actually work with DynamicIO. So let's create some really quick function for this. We'll just come in here, we'll call this function, we'll say suspended component. Again, doesn't really matter what it is. And inside here is where I want to put this p tag. So we'll just come in here and return that p tag. And I need to make sure I get my search params inside of there. So I'll come in here just like that. And I'll pass in my search params and make sure I type that properly. There we go. So that should be all the information we need. And if we make this an asynchronous function just like that, you can see we now have that suspended component. And I can come in here and use suspense. There we go. Put that suspended component directly inside of there. Pass it along my search params. Just like that, so now I no longer need to await for this here. It's awaited inside the suspense, and I can even give this a fallback if I want. For example, I can just give it a p tag that says loading. There we go. And I can get rid of this p tag down here. So essentially I replaced that p tag and just wrapped it inside of a suspense component. If I give that a save and I refresh my page, you'll notice something really interesting. First of all, I don't even get that loading text because this search params loads essentially instantaneously on my page. And when I type in something here, you can see it shows up. And even when I view my page source, it's so quick that it actually sends me down that information. You can see here, p tag with a query that has my actual query data inside of it. So I don't even get any loading state at all. And that's because this data loads so quickly on the server, even though it's dynamic, it still gets sent down to the user because it's so quick to load that it just comes down to the user. It doesn't have to wait for it. Another thing you'll notice though is it actually removed the error from my page. I still have my dynamic route, but that error is removed. Now, if I were to actually change this code back to what we had before, I'll just really quickly just go back a little bit so we have that code. There we go. This is going to be enough. You can see we get our error. And inside this error, it specifically says a component access data, headers, params, search params, or a short-lived cache without a suspense boundary. That's kind of the error we're trying to avoid. Specifically, we were dealing with search params. But it also mentions that accessing params should throw this error. But you know, if we go back to the code we had before, and we give this a quick save, you'll notice we're accessing our params right here inside of this asynchronous function. We're not putting in any suspense boundary or anything, and we're no longer getting an error. Now, I've reached out to the Next.js development team to try to figure out, is this a bug? Is this a feature? Is the error message wrong? Or is the behavior wrong? And so far, I've gotten no response from them. So I'm sure when this actually comes out of experimental and into the full production release of Next.js, they'll either decide one way or the other whether this needs to be wrapped in suspense or not. But currently, the way that it's working, you do not need to wrap params instead of a suspense boundary. It'll still work just fine with no errors. But just know that that may change in the future, and I'm not sure which way they're going to go. I've tried reaching out, and again, they just haven't gotten back to me. Now that's kind of the absolute basics of what DynamicIO is, and the nice thing about it is, again, you have to opt into caching, otherwise by default everything is going to be dynamic. So now I want to talk about how you can opt into caching, because the way you do caching with DynamicIO is quite a bit different than the way that you did it before, and I personally find it much easier to use and much more intuitive. So let's go back to our homepage, because this is going to be the easiest one to handle with caching. We just have this random data right here. And if you want to cache anything inside of this new way of Next.js, all you need to do is take either your function or your component or whatever you want, and all you do is you just put use cache at the top of that function, component, file, whatever it is you want to do. And this is going to throw it into a cache for you that is essentially indefinite. So if I give that a quick save and I come over here and I refresh my page, you now notice every time I refresh, I get the exact same data returned to me. And this page is now a static page instead of a dynamic page because I have this static data. And I can even remove my suspense boundary and everything is going to work just fine. I could take this p tag, put it right back to where I had it before, and you'll notice I no longer get any errors. And that's because you only get errors when you're accessing dynamic data if you don't have it cached or you don't have it wrapped in a suspense. In our case, we're caching that data, so we don't need to wrap it inside of a suspense. Now, I'm going to go back to what we had before, because this is probably the caching style that you're not going to use all that often. This is essentially an indefinite cache for the most part, and we generally don't want that. We want to have a shorter lived cache, or we want to have more control over the cache, and that is where things like cache tags and cacheLife come in. Now, the first type of caching that I want to talk about is going to be cache tags because they're the easiest to understand. And if you use tag-based caching either in Next.js before or in another program, it's pretty much exactly what you expect. So we can come in here and we can call the cache tag function just like this. Now you will notice this cache tag function is currently experimental, so we need to actually do a quick import of this. So we can import cache tag, and it is unstable cache tag, I believe. Come in here, cache tag, and we're just going to rename that to cache tag. There we go. So it's coming from next cache. As soon as this comes out of experimental, this will just be called cache tag, but we need to make sure we prefix it with unstable right now. So when we call this function, all you do is you just pass it an array of different strings that you want to tag this with. So in our case, we can call this random number, or we can, put something else inside of here like math, and these are going to be the two tags. So anytime you revalidate the tag of random number or math, it's going to invalidate this cache and it's going to refetch the data next time that we need to get that information. So these are the two tags that we're going to use. And right now, if we save and we refresh our page, we're going to get the exact same number every time because we have not done any revalidation of these tags. Now, revalidating these tags works just like it did with the old Next.js. We have a function called revalidate tag that we can use, and we can pass it in any tag we want. So let me show you what that would look like by just quickly creating an action that we can call with a specific button. So what I want to do is I want to go back to this particular page. I'm just going to add a button at the very top of our page that's called revalidate. And this is going to call a quick action for us. And actually that'll need to be inside of a client component for us to make it easier, or we can just do it on a form. So let's do it really quickly on a form. That's probably going to be the easiest. We can come in here with an action that's going to do that revalidate for us. We'll call this revalidate action. There we go. And then inside of our form, we'll just put our button that's going to be submitting the form. Revalidate, just like that. So let's create this function. Revalidate action. And this is going to be an async function, and it's going to be a server action. So we'll say use server on there. And all I want to do is call revalidate tag. And we can call that random number tag, and that should revalidate that for us. So let's just give that a quick save. And you'll notice again, when I refresh, I get the exact same number, 0.29, 0.29. If I go to this page and I come back, refresh, still the same number. But as soon as I click this revalidate function and I come back here, you'll now notice it has to load that number, and I get 0.45 now instead. So it's giving me a brand new number. And again, every time I refresh, exact same number until I come over here, revalidate, and go back, and now it has to load a brand new number for us. So tag-based validation is essentially exactly what you're already used to. It's rather straightforward. The big thing that's different about this new caching way versus the old caching way is it makes it easier to make your tags for your caches actually be able to depend on the actual returned values. So here I could, for example, get my completely random number. And again, imagine this is like calling an API or accessing our database. And down here, we're going to return that number. And what I could do if I wanted is I could add a cache tag in the middle. So I could say cache tag like this, and this will say something like random number, and we'll just put the random number inside of there. So I could actually use cache tags based on my returned values. This is really useful if you get like an ID for something returned and you want to tag it based on that ID. You could do that directly inside the function. Using the old way of doing like the unstable cache in Next.js that was happening before, it was a lot of annoying code that you'd have to write with weird wrappers. And now it just allows you to put these cache tags anywhere you want inside the function, and it'll just kind of automatically work for you, which I really appreciate. Now, the next way of caching that I want to talk about is the cacheLife function. So let's come in here, we're going to remove that tag, and we'll just return this like we had before. There we go. And the cacheLife function is interesting because normally when you dealt with caching inside of Next.js, the only thing you had access to was the revalidate period. And that essentially determines on the server how often that data is revalidated. So let's say that we have this cache have a revalidation time of 10 minutes. Essentially, our server will save the data for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, if someone requests that data, it'll say, hey, this data is past that 10-minute expiration. I'm still going to give you the old information, but now I'm going to calculate the new information so the next person that requests the page is going to get the new information. With the new cacheLife function, not only do we have access to the revalidate cache, but we also have access to the client cache, which is called the stale time, and we have access to an expiration time, which means it's going to remove itself from the cache after the expiration time. So if something's been in the cache for too long, it'll remove itself so it never sends that old data down to the user. And inside of Next.js, we have a few built-in methods we can use, and we can also create our own cacheLife. So by default, if you don't specify any cacheLife, you're going to get the default profile. This has a stale time of undefined, a revalidate time of 15 minutes, and it never expires. I have an infinite expiration time. So to determine the difference between stale, revalidate, and expire, if we scroll a little further into the documentation, you can see right here a description of exactly what these different values mean. Revalidate is the one you're used to if you're dealt with caching in Next.js before. It is exactly the same as the revalidate for things like fetch requests and so on. And again, this is based on the server's cache. The stale cache is based on the client cache. So let's say I set a stale time of 1 minute. That means that it is going to save the data on my client for 1 minute, and it's going to use that information without ever even going to the server. So for 1 whole minute, it's going to get information directly from the client without ever accessing the server. The revalidate time, like I mentioned, is on the server, and if you pass that revalidation time, the first person to access the server is going to get the old data, and then the next person is going to get the new data. So it's always one person behind when it does a refresh. The expire time is just when it removes itself from the cache entirely. So if you have an expiration time, let's say 20 minutes, after 20 minutes, the cache is going to clear itself on the server, which means no one's going to get stale data. The first person to request it from the server is just going to have to wait for it to calculate new data, and that gets sent back down to them. So now if we go ahead and we take a look at this, the default is essentially very similar to how caching normally worked inside of Next.js. We have no caching on the client, we have a 15-minute server cache, and then it never expires at all. So it's always going to have this cached value inside of there somewhere that someone is going to get. And then we have some defaults based on how long the data lives. So they kind of named these based on how long you want your cache to live. So seconds is for very short-lived information that changes essentially every second or every couple seconds. Minutes is for data updates every couple minutes, hours for hours, days for days, weeks, and max, and so on. So depending on how frequently your data updates, you can use one of these defaults if you want, or you can define your own. So let's just really quickly take a look at what this might look like. We can come in here and we can use cacheLife, which again, we'll have to make sure we import up here. So we can say unstable cacheLife as, and we'll just rename it to cacheLife just like that. And now we can come down here and we can say cacheLife, and we can specify one of these different values. For example, we can specify seconds, and this is going to be a very short-lived caching instance. So if we refresh our page, you can see we're getting a new data piece pretty much every single time that we refresh our page because it's only lasting in the cache for 1 single second. So let's go ahead and try to define our own cache so we can see the differences between these different values. So to do that, we can actually pass in an object here, and this object is going to take our expire, our revalidate, and our stale times that we want to pass along. So let's say that by default, we want this to go stale after 2 seconds, or let's do 5 seconds. So it's going to get the same data from the client every 5 seconds. If we go ahead and we set a revalidate to 10 seconds, what's going to happen is it's going to revalidate with the server every 10 seconds. So essentially after 10 seconds, it's going to get a new piece of data on the server. And then finally, we can set an expire to 20. So to see exactly how this looks, if we just refresh our page, you can see we're getting this value of 0.38. Now, if we swap different pages, you can see it still gives me that 0.38 value. Now, after 10 seconds, if I were to call my server again, it's still going to give me that 0.38 value. You can see here, I'm going to refresh my page, and it looks like this time it actually gave me a new value, most likely because I passed my expiration threshold. So let me set that really large. So now here we have 5 seconds and 10 seconds. And to make this even clearer, let's do 1, and we're going to do 5, just like that. So we can give my page a quick refresh, and you can see here we have 0.49. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait a while so that it's been at least 5 seconds. And you'll notice when I refresh my page, I get the same value of 0.449. So we get that a refresh, and actually this time it's loading us a brand new value. And the reason I think for that is because we're in development mode versus in production mode, and the caching works slightly differently. Essentially in development mode, it always gives you back the new revalidated value, while in production mode it doesn't. So let me just start our server in production mode. So I just finished building this site in production, and I actually want to mention one thing that changed since the last time I used the Canary version of this, and that is that this dynamic IO property where I talked about params not throwing that error inside of development, it actually throws that error when you try to build for production. So if you have params, you need to make sure you wrap them in a suspense if you're using await on them. Otherwise, you're going to get an error when you build for production, which is something that I did not encounter in the past, but is now a newer feature. So my guess is that going forward, that this error message should show up in development, and it doesn't. So that's just something that they need to fix. But essentially, anytime you're using async code, including for params, you need to wrap it inside of a suspense boundary. But now that I have my application built, I can show you what I'm talking about with this stale, revalidate, and expire. So let's go over here. We're going to refresh our page, and you notice we still got back the same value, 2.284. It's been way more than 5 seconds since I last refreshed this page, but now when I go and refresh my page, you can see I get a new value. So that's just showing you that the revalidate only gives you a new value essentially the second time you hit the page. The first user to hit that revalidate gets the old data. The second user to hit that is going to get the new data because it refreshes in the background. Expire, on the other hand, if we were to change that to like 2 seconds, or not 2 seconds, but like 10 seconds, if we waited longer than 5 seconds, but less than 10 seconds, it would give us the old data. But if we waited longer than 10 seconds, it would now give us a brand new piece of data the first time that we access the page because there's nothing stored inside the cache anymore. Also, another really nice thing is you may want to use some of these default values that are built in, but they may not define exactly like you want them. Maybe you want this to be a 1-minute cache instead of 5-minute cache. This is actually something you can change on your own in the Next.js config. All you need to do is come inside of here and you can specify cacheLife, and this allows you to define your own custom caches. So let's call this one custom, and you can see we can set our own stale, revalidate, and expire time. So I can set this to 5, we can come in here to revalidate to 10, and expire of 20, for example, and now I have access to this custom property that I can use, and I can come into here and I can say cacheLife of custom. I even get autocomplete and everything, and now it's set up with that custom configuration, so you can share these across your entire application. So the combination of cache tags and cacheLife make it really easy for you to cache the things you want to be cached on your page while keeping the other things dynamic. Now, personally, I use cache tag much more often than cacheLife because more often than not, the data that I'm caching is going to be changing based on specific events. Let's say that you have a list of users and you add a new user to your application, well, then you're probably going to want to invalidate that tag specifically for the user list or the user information. But if you have data that's just updating on a somewhat frequent basis, or maybe not even that frequent, and you don't have a specific thing that is telling you that this data is changing, like maybe you're just pulling an API to get new information from it, and you don't want to pull that API every time someone makes a request, you just want to pull it every, 10 seconds or so, you can use cacheLife for those types of scenarios where the data doesn't change super often, so you don't care if it's slightly out of date. But again, I usually use cache tag for most of my application needs. Now, one other thing I haven't really mentioned yet is that you can use cache on anything you want. For example, you can use it on a function, you can use it on a component, and it's going to cache that component's information, and you can even use it on an entire file. So I can put it all the way at the top of my file here. Now, if you use it on a file, essentially it's exactly the same as just putting use cache inside of every single function and component and everything in that file. So I don't usually put it on a file specific level, and instead I specifically mostly use this on functions that access data. But if you want, you can use it on a component level instead if you find that makes your workflow a little easier. But generally I find just putting it directly where I access my data is the best way to work with it, because more often than not, my data access is the thing that's dynamic, and my components are just rendering that dynamic data. So I usually put the use cache specifically in the section of the data portion. Now, I know I've kind of thrown a lot at you specifically with this video, but the main thing that I want you to take away from this is that DynamicIO essentially opts you out of caching by default, and you need to specifically specify the things that you want to be cached in your application. Otherwise, it's automatically going to be dynamic if you use asynchronous data. Now, if you don't use any asynchronous data in your component, for example, I just render a plain H1 like this, that's not asynchronous at all. If I give that a save and I go and I refresh that specific page, you'll notice here that this is a static page. So it only makes you a dynamic page when you use dynamic asynchronous data. Otherwise, it will be static, which is what you want. But the really nice thing is now you can opt into caching instead of having to opt out of caching. And if you like this video and you want to dive even deeper into the newest features inside of Next.js and really just master Next.js, highly recommend checking out my Next.js Simplified course. I will link it in the description for you. It's currently 10% off for a very limited time of just a few days because I just updated the course literally a couple days ago. I uploaded the last video, so I highly recommend checking that out. And if you want to master React as well, you can buy my React and Next.js course as a bundle for an even cheaper price, and that is also 10% off because I just updated that course to include React 19. And again, I just finished the last video just a couple days ago. So if you're interested in checking either of those courses out, they'll both be linked in the description for you. Highly recommend checking out if you want to master Next.js or React. With that said, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.